So let's take a look at what happens when we have a significant interaction effect. The variables I have here, I'm analyzing sleep time again from the Behavioral Risk Factor Surveillance Survey, and I'm looking at two specific factors here. One is animal feed. This was kind of an interesting one. The participants were asked in the past 12 months, have you made an attempt to buy meat raised without antibiotics? So it was kind of this level of health consciousness while shopping, which may or may not be too extreme. It was an interesting question. And then race, we have 6 categories of races, just like race, just like in the video for the focus task. So here is the results of the ANOVA. One thing I wanted to mention quickly, the effect size. I don't think I had put that into everything in all of the videos. And part of the reason is just because it's not where it is a measure of effect size, and it's nice to have coupled with the p-value, certainly. It's a little hard to interpret it in an ANOVA, for me, a little more harder than the R-squared is in a regression. Notice, first of all, that the eta squared, this is called eta, and the partial eta squared are very similar. The partial eta squared is typically what you'll see reported in some publications. And again, you can think of it roughly as the percent of explained variance that this explains in the outcome. However, here we would want to be careful, because even though you might gravitate towards that significant effect right there, we need to start off with the interaction effect. So here we have something that's below 0.05, so we have a significant interaction. And if we look at the visual of that, we can see pretty clearly that there's a significant interaction. So the null hypothesis of the interaction term would say that all of the lines in this graph are parallel, that they have the same slope. You might get lines that don't quite have the same slope, and it's not a significant interaction. That's certainly possible. But if you do have a significant interaction and you look at the plots, you should expect to see that at least 2 of your lines are pretty clearly not parallel. They may not cross over. That's an extreme thing. But you should expect that something there is not parallel. And here we can see that almost everything is not parallel here. So how do we interpret something like this? Well, let's remind ourselves again what's going on in this graph. We have 12 different categories. So here are the people who said, yes, I've made an attempt to buy meat without use of antibiotics. So these are a little more, when they're doing their shopping, for whatever reason, they don't they have the extra money, or they're concerned about it, or they're paranoid about it, or without putting a value judgment on it. These are the ones who are making a conscious use to avoid the ones with the antibiotics, and these are the ones who are not. So that gives us 2 large groups, but then within each of those we have 6 different races, even though you can hardly see there's 2 races there are overlapped. So let's say you ask me, well, does the amount of sleep differ based on people, whether or not people actually made that decision for animal feed, or to avoid the meat used with antibiotics, where antibiotics were used? And I would say, well, it depends. If we're talking white, so number 1 here is white, it didn't really make a difference, right? The group that was shopping more consciously and was not shopping more consciously, they got about the same amount of sleep. But if we're talking about, say, which group is this? This is the other group. This is the American Indian Alaskan Native right here, and that one it certainly did. The group who wasn't shopping consciously didn't avoid the antibiotic use. They slept a lot more than the ones who did avoid the antibiotic. Now, the reason I hesitated on this group was because I think the sample size is really small. But we see that same in the black group here, the group that didn't avoid the meat with antibiotic use slept on average longer than the group who did avoid. And that's not always the case, though, for Asians, which is number 3, and the other group. In both of those cases, the ones who did avoid the antibiotic use slept longer than the other ones. So it really varied by race, which raises some interesting questions. We'd also want to know if these differences were significant. So just by looking at this graph, I can say, oh, that looks pretty different from that. But keeping in mind that the sample size might not be very large, we don't know yet if this is a trend we would expect to see in Pennsylvania adults in general. So that's where we would go to post hoc tests. And instead of putting in one of the main effects, now because there is a significant interaction, we're going to put that in. We're going to see quite a few more comparisons, because when we're talking interactions, we're talking a lot of different possible comparisons you can make. There's really 12 groups here, and there's a lot of little combinations there. So let's take a look at a specific one. So those white, we're fairly certain were not different. Let's take a look at what the p-value is on that, or the effect size. So this would be, whites are the group 1. So we're comparing 1, 1 and 2, 1. So 1, 1 and 2, 1. So these would be the whites who avoided the antibiotic use and the whites who didn't. And you can see the p-value, once we adjust for multiple comparisons, is, I mean, you couldn't get a higher p-value than that. 1 is the max. So yeah, we're definitely not a difference there on or we certainly didn't pick that up in the data. Let's take one that's a little more extreme. So let's take that group of Alaskan Natives, American Indians, and let's compare. So this would be 1, 4 and 2, 4. 1, 4 and 2, 4. Even there, we're not seeing statistical significance. Again, that's because of the sample size of that group is so small. If we look at the Hispanic group, perhaps, I think that was a larger sample size. So here we have the group that wasn't avoiding the antibiotics actually sleeping longer than the group that was avoiding. And this would be 1, 5 and 2, 5. So here we have 1, 5 and 2, 5. And there's also not as significant. So we did see that in the sample, that the group that didn't avoid was higher than the group that did avoid the antibiotic use, the food with antibiotic use. So are there any significant? Now we're going to go ahead and just p-hack this thing. We're just going to look, were there any places where there were significance? And here we do see some significance. There's a 0.002. So what group was that? That was 1, 1 and 1, 5. So 1, 1 is right here, and 1, 5 is down here. And now we're seeing it's not on the opposite side, right? What we're seeing is the group that was Asian and who did avoid was very different sleep-wise than the group who was Hispanic and did avoid. So they're both avoiding the food with the use of antibiotics. And here, that Asian group that avoided was sleeping far more than the Hispanic group that was avoided. And we can also see right there 2-1 and 1-5. So here we are crossing over 2-1 and 1-5. That'd be 2-1 right there and 1-5. So the whites who did not avoid and the Hispanics who did avoid, we see a significant difference there. The whites who didn't avoid sleeping more than the Hispanics who did avoid. And if we wanted to get a sense for how big that mean difference was, we can also look right here. So in terms of how big that was, it was over a half hour's worth, almost it looks like about 45 minutes of sleep. If you would multiply this number times 60, because there's 60 minutes in an hour, I think it'd be about almost 45 minutes of sleep difference that the whites who did avoid were getting more than the whites who didn't avoid were getting more than the Hispanics who did avoid. So you could go through there and start to look. The big point here is that if there's an interaction effect, we really need to look at these races as separate categories on the animal feed, and we need to look at the animal feed as separate categories on the races. Just because it does depend, we can't say that it's equal across every race or across every category here on the animal feed. So certainly still possible to interpret, but you do need to go under a finer lens to see where the differences are and where those significant differences are.